Welcome to Silicon Valley, birthplace of the integrated circuit, the microprocessor, the personal computer, the smartphone, the social media revolution, the gig economy, and who knows what else in a few years' time. It's home to some of the wealthiest, most powerful companies in history, including the first to hit $1 trillion market cap. At the helm of these companies, whose valuations gradually encroach on the GDPs of entire countries, is a technocracy with globe-spanning influence, and I mean truly globe-spanning. As of today, there are 5 billion social media users and 6.6 billion smartphones across the world. More iPhones are produced each day than babies are born. For better or worse, we are more connected than ever before. We laugh at the same memes, Google the same names, follow the same digital creators, and download the same apps. But what if I told you that the whole thing was something of an accident? That the region now known as Silicon Valley really had no right to be the epicenter of all these technological developments? What if I told you that there was a time, not that long ago, when this place was nothing more than a vast expanse of orchards, the main export being apricots rather than anything built out of silicon? Well, if you're to believe me, we have to start at the beginning. We have to go all the way back to the gold rush. It is 1848 and the first flakes of gold have been found in California, setting off a mass migration of hundreds of thousands lured by the prospect of easy riches. Like the original colonists who settled the American East Coast, they came from all walks of life, but from an even wider selection of the world. From North and South America, from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Russia, and even from Australia. And as they pour in, they hammer into being a new order, re-energizing a dormant American economy and earning California its statehood in just 2 years, even as they displace the indigenous communities. Boomtowns like San Francisco crop up all over, going from hundreds of residents to thousands in the blink of an eye. Those who made the often perilous journey to California, whether over land or by sea, subscribed to a new variant of the American dream. It differed fundamentally from the steady, gradual accumulation of wealth that Benjamin Franklin envisioned in Poor Richard's Almanac. People now dreamed of instant wealth and overnight success, sometimes at the expense of those around them. To these dreamers, high risk and high reward were the only things worth living for. One can therefore say that, from its very inception, California was a magnet for the grasping and opportunistic among us. But not all these opportunists were out panning for gold. Some, like Leland Stanford, simply pursued mercantile endeavors, taking advantage of a customer base held captive by its own greed. In the process, Stanford became stupendously rich and powerful. He served as governor of California and head of the company that built the western part of the Transcontinental Railroad. But none of these accomplishments brought him lasting satisfaction. In 1885, his guilty conscience compelled him to found the Leland Stanford Jr. University, named after his deceased son, in Palo Alto. Today, we know it as Stanford University. At a time when all Palo Alto consisted of was a train stop and horse ranch, Stanford prophesied that it would grow wealthy from canning and exporting fruit to the rest of the world. Sure enough, his prediction came true. At its height, the valley would boast 39 canneries, leading the world in fruit production and packing. A big reason why was Stanford University, which would have an agricultural department and emphasize practical education meant to provide direct usefulness in life. This, along with its admittance of women and lack of tuition, set it apart from the liberal arts institutions like Harvard and Yale. Stanford University's focus on practicality spilled over to more than just agronomy, though. In 1909, it was none other than Cyril Elwell, a Stanford graduate, who founded the Federal Telegraph Company, an early pioneer of radio communications. And Stanford's founding president and faculty were the ones that provided Elwell with the seed capital that he needed to found the company in the first place. Elwell's company leveraged the fact that, as a burgeoning seaport, the Bay Area needed radios for maritime orientation. The combined experiences of the Titanic and First World War demonstrated the importance of radio operators to shipping companies across the world, including in the Bay Area, which began importing radio parts en masse. By the 1920s, the Bay Area had a much larger than average supply of these parts, and was home to 10% of the licensed ham radio operators in all of the United States. And that might have been the end of the story had it not been for the Second World War. This was a war unlike any that preceded it, not only in terms of the sheer devastation, number of casualties, and geographic scope, but also because of the extent to which technology would determine the outcome. To mobilize the forces of science in the struggle, President Roosevelt relied largely on one man, Vannevar Bush. This was no fumbling bureaucrat, but an engineer's engineer. whose resume included a joint doctorate from MIT and Harvard, and his experience co-founding Raytheon in 1922. Bush enlisted the brightest minds in the American university system through the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which would end up dishing out almost $500 million on research and development. Of that amount, MIT received $117 million, Harvard and Columbia received about $30 million, and Stanford got about $50,000. The two most important research centers were MIT's and Harvard's. MIT's radiation lab would focus on developing radar technology to bolster America's offensive capabilities, while Harvard's radio research lab was to focus on radar jamming and other defensive radar technologies. Harvard's lab was run by Stanford's very own Frederick Terman, who was one of Bush's doctoral students and a foremost expert in vacuum tubes and circuits. What you need to know about Terman is that he was a Bay Area man through and through. From the age of 10, he grew up in Palo Alto playing with ham radios, and then went on to receive his master's degree in electrical engineering at Stanford, returning to his alma mater as a faculty member just like his dad. It didn't sit right with Terman that the vast majority of the federal research and development budget was being channeled to East Coast schools. So as soon as the war ended, he returned to Stanford with the intention of making it the MIT of the West. As the newly appointed dean of the School of Engineering, he was in a position to make it happen, and he quickly recruited 11 members of the Harvard Research Lab as Stanford faculty. Owing to their experiences during the war, these men were now some of the foremost experts in electronics and microwave research in the world, placing Stanford on a very firm footing to land government research contracts in the face of the emerging Soviet threat. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, the size of Stanford's electronics program had doubled, paving the way for the university to become a full-fledged partner in the military-industrial complex. Terman established what came to be known as Stanford's Steeples of Excellence, i.e., electrical engineering, microwave research, and materials science. It would be these fields that guaranteed Stanford's ascendance in the post-war world. During this time, Terman also made a habit of mentoring various companies and even sitting on their boards. He encouraged the faculty to follow his example, stressing the importance of a collaborative relationship between practitioners and researchers. Even before the outbreak of the Second World War, in fact, Terman had encouraged Bill Hewlett and David Packard, both Stanford alumni, to start their own company. After the pair scraped together $595, they started Hewlett-Packard, or HP for short, out of their garage in true Silicon Valley style. Perhaps most importantly, in the early 1950s, Terman developed a 350-acre research park that gave tenants access to Stanford students and faculty. The park leased land early on to Hewlett-Packard, Varian Associates, General Electric, Lockheed, and Eastman Kodak. Terman's single-minded quest to secure Stanford's rise in the post-war world succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. It was a critical factor behind the surrounding region's gradual transformation into the hotbed of innovation that we know today. For this reason, Terman has been called one of the fathers of Silicon Valley. But if he was just one of the fathers of Silicon Valley, that begs the question, who else could have contributed nearly as much as Terman? That would be William Shockley, who is simultaneously one of the most brilliant researchers and terrible bosses in American history. You see, Shockley was one of the inventors of the transistor, which is the foundational building block of the semiconductor economy. Put another way, the personal computer would never have been possible without the invention of the transistor. This was the hyper-efficient successor to the unwieldy vacuum tubes that Frederick Terman and others in the Bay Area had tinkered with for decades. It was an invention so important that Shockley received the Nobel Prize. One prominent technologist has gone so far as to say that Silicon Valley is, in some ways, an accident of William Shockley being born there. It's not that far off from the truth. The only problem with Shockley was that he was a completely unbearable human being. So in 1957, only 2 years after he founded his semiconductor company, 8 of his founding employees quit and formed their own company, called Fairchild Semiconductor. This group has since become known to history as the Traitorous Eight. Fairchild is as foundational a company to Silicon Valley as HP, if not more so. Pretty much every semiconductor company to come out of the valley could trace its lineage back to Fairchild. Not only that, it was the recipient of the first real venture capital funding from Arthur Rock, a far-sighted New York financier who relocated to the West Coast and reinvented himself as a startup investor. Within only 3 months of being founded, the company landed a government contract to make 100 transistors out of, you guessed it, silicon. Just like Stanford, Fairchild's bread was buttered by the US government, with federal contracts accounting for 80% of its business. In 1959, Fairchild brought the world the planar process, which famed science fiction writer Isaac Asimov called, with some permissible exaggeration, the most important moment since man emerged as a life form. Even if we don't go that far, this was, without question, the next domino to fall in the process that brought us the personal computer, allowing multiple transistors to be placed on a single silicon wafer after being coated with chemical oxide. The process facilitated the creation of Bob Noyce's integrated circuit, which he filed a patent for in 1961. Around the same time, Texas Instruments' Jack Kilby filed a patent for an integrated circuit made out of germanium. The use of silicon in integrated circuits would give Californian firms like Fairchild an edge, being easier to manufacture at scale. Although the first chips produced by Fairchild cost $1,000 a piece, by 1963, the price was down to just $25. During the period from Fairchild's founding in 1957 to 1969, 90% of all American chip-making firms were based in today's Silicon Valley. It helped that these were the golden years of federally funded research and development, fueled by a race to beat the Soviets to the moon and outspend them here on Earth. In the wake of Lyndon B. Johnson's passage of the Small Business Investment Act, hundreds of small business investment companies were set up, with every dollar being matched by the feds 3-to-1. The plan was drawn up by Georges Doriot, who had been behind the concept of the American Research and Development Corporation, or ARD for short. Unlike the ARD, these small business investment companies would be structured as partnerships instead of corporations, and would seek to take less ownership in the businesses they invested in. These vehicles for investment are important to our story because they made some of the earliest investments in electronics, accounting for something like 3/4 of venture capital funding in 1968. The initial capital came from fortunes minted in the varied industries of timber, agriculture, shipbuilding, and coffee. San Francisco-based banks and insurance companies also got in on the action. Lawyers did too, but in a different way, taking payment in stock options instead of cash. An ecosystem was beginning to form around supporting early-stage technology companies, especially in electronics. The contributions of Leland Stanford, Fred Terman, and Will Shockley were beginning to bear fruit, but it would take much more for the region they had all loved and labored for to capture the attention of the nation, much less the world at large. Silicon Valley in the 1960s was still a far cry from being the modern Florence, and the term Silicon Valley hadn't even been coined yet. Sure, the valley had blazed a new trail with vacuum tubes, transistors, and now integrated circuits, but there had been plenty of other places across the United States that had similarly pioneered exciting and promising technologies. As in the case of Boston and its radios, Detroit and its automobiles, Dayton and its biplanes, Rochester and its cameras, and Cleveland and its light bulbs. Boston and Chicago in particular still appeared far more suited to being America's leading technopolis in the decades to come. And in the wake of mounting deficits and environmental concerns, all these hubs of innovation, Silicon Valley included, would have to contend with a considerably deflated federal research and development budget. So how is it that Silicon Valley is where it is today? That is precisely the question we'll finish answering in the next video.